So this lesson today is going to be a continuation of our previous lesson where we're exploring the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And then we're comparing that to a Greek god who's called Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is the god of wine, and he's also said to be able to turn water into wine. So in our previous lesson, we looked at how that prevalence of Dionysus was even in the land of Israel. So Dionysus was a very popular god, and oddly enough, he was often confused as being the god of Israel. So one thing we can note from history is that in 139 BC, the Jews that were living in Rome were expelled because those leaders in Rome thought the Jews were worshiping what they called a foreign god, and that god was Dionysus. Now, if you look this up, you'll see that it goes under a different name because Dionysus is Greek, but Sabazios, that is the Phrygian name for the god Dionysus. Now, Phrygia is a region in what we call Turkey today, but just east of Ephesus. So apparently the leaders in Rome confused the worship of God with the worship of Dionysus. Now, was this the only time that happened? No, it was not. So if you go to our website, and there will be a link to this below, you're going to find information on a Greek writer and a philosopher named Plutarch. Now, Plutarch is writing on the Jews and how he is convinced that they are actually worshiping Dionysus, but just by a different name. And what he's looking at is all of the wine and the vine symbolism that's involved in worship and even the weekly Sabbath. But particularly, he mentions the Feast of Tabernacles, and he says they must be worshiping Dionysus. So we have to understand that in Jesus' day, there existed confusion about the worship of Dionysus and even some of the worship practices within Judaism. And then you have John's audience there in Ephesus, and they would be very familiar with Dionysus. So John includes a story in his gospel that the other gospels don't include, and that's the miracle of turning water into wine. Now, there must have been a very good reason for him to do that, and scholars believe it because it has to do with his audience. He is doing this, he's including this miracle that Jesus did because it sends a message to those who understand the worship of Dionysus. He's directly confronting Dionysus by including this miracle, and what he's telling his audience is that Jesus is greater than Dionysus. Dionysus offers transformation, but it is not authentic transformation. And if you're looking for authentic transformation, then make Jesus, who's the Logos of God, as your object of worship. So Jesus offers authentic transformation and is therefore greater than Dionysus. So as we continue this exploration, please make a mental note that there did exist confusion in the first century that we might not pick up on today. And that John is doing this. He's taking the gods of those Greeks head on, and he uses the stories of Jesus' miracle to go directly at them to say Jesus is greater than everything that you understand about the world around you. Now, one brief announcement before we go on. We do have a weekly live Bible study. It's called the Fig Tree Coffee Club. We meet each Wednesday morning. It's 9 a.m. Central Time. That's in the United States. We do have some people joining us from outside the U.S., and it's over Zoom. So it lasts about an hour and a half, and we're working our way through the Gospel of John, but it offers you a chance to ask questions, listen to the discussion, and go a little bit deeper into these topics. Now, there's no cost to join. You just go to this link right here that says the Coffee Club, you add your name to our mailing list, And then each week, you'll receive a handout for that lesson and the Zoom link. And you're more than welcome to join us whenever you're available. Okay, so let's get back to this week's lesson. Okay, so let's move on your handout. And the rabbis, just like today, lots of people today, they want to know, what was the fruit that Eve ate? Was it an apple? Was it a pomegranate? Was it, whatever it was? Well, the rabbis, they had the same type of discussion. And the reality is, God doesn't tell us in Genesis what that fruit was. And since God didn't tell us, the rabbis debated it. And I just want to show you two of those. So there's a rabbi named Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir says that the fruit that Eve ate was the vine. Now you can check, I have the source to this on your handout, so make sure you check that. But what he's doing is Rabbi Meir is looking at the Noah story. So the Noah story is a decreation event. The waters that above and the waters below came back out and flooded the earth. It's followed by recreation. You have all the same blessings that we find in Genesis 1. And then when Noah lands, the first thing he does is plants a vineyard. Now, unfortunately, he ends up drunk. And so what Rabbi Meir is saying, that nothing brings more trouble on a human being than wine. And so perhaps wine, the grape of the vine, was the cause of all the problems that plague humanity. Now, of course, nobody agrees, and so another rabbi comes along and says, no, it was the fig tree. And that's because when God clothed them, he took fig leaves. But if you notice something, we've got fig tree and we've got vine. And fig tree was in John chapter 1, and vine is in John chapter 2. So he knows these rabbinic dialogues, and perhaps he's weaving all of this together because his audience knows the symbolism. They know the Genesis symbolism and the arguments that people are making. Again, you cannot underestimate the importance of Genesis chapter 1 in Jewish thought. And then another thing that we talked about in John chapter 2 is just simply the idea of having a wedding. Wedding is the image that the Bible uses for God, his people, and redemption. So throughout the Bible, you have the wedding language. In fact, even with the church is the bride of Christ, awaiting the bridegroom. Mount Sinai is a wedding. The language in the book of Exodus is wedding language. So wedding helps us understand something about the relationship between God and humanity. And perhaps what John is doing is he's saying, Jesus is the bridegroom. He's coming to get his bride, all of creation. And so what we have at the beginning of the Gospel of John is a wedding. And you have the overflowing grace from God, the favor that he's going to give humanity prior to any ritual. This abundant grace that happens when the bridegroom comes to get his bride. Another symbol that we noticed, and I mentioned last week, has to do with the Messianic age, that the Messianic age is defined by fig tree and vine. And so, if Jesus is the Messiah, then this would be the beginning of the Messianic age, and we get a story then about fig tree and vine. Just another piece that's going to help us build this collage of symbols to help us understand what John is pointing to. Now, I want to show you some places in the Old Testament where you'll find some symbolism to vine and wine. And I'm just going to start here with Psalm 104. I'm not going to read it, but I want you to know, go check out Psalm 104 and see that it's going to match up a bit with John. And so in Psalm 104, you see a picture of the Messianic age. And what we see in Psalm 104 is that wine gladdens the heart. Wine brings joy. And then we can notice the movement that's happening. God brings forth water from the springs. And so there's living water that flows out of those springs. And then that living water creates wine. And the wine gladdens the heart. So we've at least got a connection and symbolism that comes from our Old Testament. So check out Psalm 104. But what I will look at today is Psalm 80. This is a very interesting psalm, and I think we can easily connect this psalm to the Gospel of John. There's so much symbolism here that lines up with John. So for instance, Psalm 80 talks about the shepherd of Israel. And what does Jesus say? I am the shepherd. This is a long standing from Ezekiel, where God says, I myself will become the shepherd. So it starts out shepherd. The next is that it connects to Joseph and Ephraim. So most of the time we think of Psalms as Psalms of David, but in this case, this is a Psalm of Joseph. And we've talked about in previous lessons here on John, the importance of understanding that John isn't necessarily pulling from the line of David, Jesus as king, but he's pulling from this story of the suffering Messiah, Joseph. So this psalm is not a psalm of David. And then finally, we get talk of salvation and restoration, restoring them back into the household of God. That's redemption. So if we look at a few verses in Psalm 80, it starts out, O shepherd of Israel, pay attention, you who lead Joseph like a flock of sheep. You who sit enthroned above the cherubim, reveal your splendor. Well, who's the shepherd of Israel? God, and then Jesus. And then it says, in the sight of Ephraim, Benjamin, and Manasseh, reveal your power. Come and save us. O God, restore us. Smile on us, then we will be saved. So there's our message of salvation, redemption. But then it's going to go on and it's going to talk about the vine. Verse 8 says, you transplanted a vine from Egypt. Who's the vine? Well, here it's Israel. So the psalmist is calling Israel a vine. You drove out the nations and you planted it. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. So Israel is the vine. The problem is that they were supposed to produce good fruit. That's from Isaiah chapter 5, and Jesus uses that to tell a parable. But they were supposed to produce fruit in the land, and they didn't. And so you get, again, this imagery that Israel is the vine, and of course Jesus is going to say, I'm the true vine. Let's go on. It says, now this is where it gets really interesting. It says, let your hand rest on the man at your right hand, the Son of Man you have raised up for yourself. So who is this man that sits at the right hand of God? The Son of Man. Well, obviously, we would say that is Jesus. This is a really important psalm. I think you would benefit from becoming familiar with it and being able to connect this symbolism of vine and vineyard to the people of Israel. Now, one thing I want to note, check out our website, and I'll have a link below. There's a handout there that you can download that has a reference to a writer. His name is Plutarch. And Plutarch, he's convinced that the Jewish people are worshiping Dionysus. Why? Because there's so much emphasis on wine. Now, he doesn't understand fully the Hebrew religion, the God of Israel. All he sees is all of this emphasis on wine. He says, aha, they must be worshiping Dionysus by another name. Because Dionysus has a name, a different name in different regions. So I want you to see that there's so much emphasis on wine, so much emphasis on the vine, so much emphasis on living water and bringing joy. And all of that is symbolic in the mind of Israel. And of course, John is tapping into those symbols to help us understand something about Jesus. Okay, now that's Jewish symbolism. And what I want to do is do a little bit of Greek symbolism. So we talked about that for the Greek mind, wine is a gift from the gods. Wine is transformative. There's a mysterious fermentation process. Everything about wine is a blessing, so it clearly must be a gift from the gods. And of course, wine is a big deal in that culture. So the Greeks said, look, wine is a divine process. Greeks were inventing science, but they're just at the beginning, and they don't have the full understanding of science that we do today. But they recognize that, hey, we have this plant over here that looks dead. And then the rain falls, so water comes down, and the plant is going to come back to life. So water brings life. And the next thing you know, you've got a grape now growing. Now, we don't exactly know how that happens, but we have a grape. Then you have another mysterious process, is that you have the fermentation process. When we take that grape, and it turns into wine that gladdens our heart. This can only be a divine process, the work of a god. So the wine, it becomes this idea of a gift for humanity. It takes you, it in a way, it lifts you up out of the mundane of life. And now you become in this state of ecstasy that they recognized was different than everyday life. And it was because of this wine. And in their minds, they became one with the God who created this. So there's a God who wants to lift you up out of the mundane of everyday life. Who's that God who wants to do that? Well, this is where we get to Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine. And scholars can date him back to somewhere around 13 or 1400 BC. He's been around for a long time. Now, he's got many different names depending on the culture, but he's always associated with the same symbols. So since Dionysus is a plant god, the god of the vine, that every year the vine dies and then comes back to life, so does Dionysus. So he's associated with death, resurrection. The myth of Dionysus, he dies and is brought back to life. So there's a recognition of something about new life that this god brings. Now there's something interesting about Dionysus, and that we'll talk more in the future about this, is he's not a god originally of the Olympians. He's not an Olympian god. This is going to be important. But he is a foreign god. He comes from outside. And he's a god that's very personal, that you can become one with. And part of becoming one with that God is a process of transformation. And so wine transforms you. It brings joy. And so they recognize if we ingest this God, we are transformed in a way. And this is really important for John. He wants us to understand that yes, you do transform when you drink wine. But if you lean on Dionysus for your transformation, it's not going to go well in the long run. Jesus will transform you. He's the one you want to place your faith in because you are created in the image of God, and Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So that's what you want to transform into. But the point is, you ingest the God and you transform. Now, the final point, I think this is really important, is that whenever they said that water was turned into wine, or wine miraculously showed up, they said, aha, the presence of that God was with them, dwelling with them at their festival. And we could say then, this is exactly what's going on at Cana when that story is told again. John's audience says, aha, the God is present. It says God is with them. When they see that the water transforms to wine, that is the presence of God there. And of course, we think about Jesus' names. One of his names is Emmanuel, which means God with us. So this is a really important one, that the presence of God is with Jesus at that wedding, causing the transformation of water to wine. Okay, let's go. I want to show you a couple sources. I have these on your handout. There are a number of different sources from the ancient world that talk about Dionysus, and you can go read them, but I want to show you at least one of them. And all of the stories are something about transformation, whether the wine comes out of nothing, whether there's a water that turns into wine, whether it's an empty bucket that gets filled with wine. But it's all about some transformation. It's all about abundance, okay? And so I just want to show you one of them, because in this story, they say that, look, we had a temple, and the priests are going to put these empty pots, 3 empty pots. And the next morning, when the people show up, they're going to be filled with wine. Okay, and so it says, an old theater and a shrine of Dionysus. Of the gods, they worshipped Dionysus with the greatest of reverence, and they asserted that the god attended their festival. That's the presence of God with them. So 3 pots are brought into the building by the priest. They're set down empty in the presence of the citizens and any strangers who may have a chance to be in the country. The doors of the building are sealed by the priests themselves and by any others who are so inclined. You can watch the process. And when they show up the next morning, they examine the seals, they go into the building, and the pots are filled with wine. This is the story. Now, the author here goes on to tell us that he never actually saw it happen. And that's significant when we think about the wedding at Cana. Because how many people saw the miracle happen? Everybody. The servants, Jesus' mother, his disciples, the attendant. Well, especially the servants. They were the ones who actually witnessed the transformation. So when Jesus does it, it wasn't something that was done behind closed doors. It was right out in the open. The transformative power of God was with them, dwelling with them there in Cana, Emmanuel. Okay, so main points here. Water to wine in that ancient Greek mind is evidence of the presence of God. Drinking wine was to drink the blood of Dionysus. And it was the idea of entering into a mystical union. And John wants us to enter into a mystical union with Jesus. And Jesus is going to talk about drinking his blood and eating his flesh. And so you can see there would be a lot of confusion in that day. But this idea that drinking the wine was transformational, it broke down barriers. You felt liberated. And John's going to make the point that you do not want that to become your process of liberation. You want to ingest, metaphorically, Jesus and allow the power of the Holy Spirit to transform your life. And this is going to transform you into what you were originally designed to be. So there's so much symbolism, and I want to make sure you understand it's both the Jewish world and the Greek world. Wine, the vine, was very important in the Old Testament, the abundance of wine in the Messianic age, and of course that Greek world, because John is there in Ephesus. They understand Dionysus. And so he's going to tell a story. Why is it not in the other Gospels? Because John's addressing this particularly to his audience to give them a message about something that has to do with this transformation and the power of transformation.